There's an older, but again, a wonderful film. You perhaps have seen it, Fiddler on the Roof. And in that film, at the beginning of it, Tevye, the main character, speaks of tradition. And he says, in our village of Anatevka, we have traditions for everything. How to work, how to wear clothes. For instance, he points to his cap, we always keep our head covered. And then he points to a little tassel coming off his jacket and says, we always wear a little prayer shawl. And this shows our constant devotion to God. And you may ask, how did this tradition get started? And I'll tell you, he says, I don't know. But it's tradition. And because of our tradition, everybody knows who he is and what God expects him to do. Should be an inclusive hymn. Traditions are part of life. Sometimes we carry out traditions ourselves simply because that's the way it always has been. And sometimes, like Tevye, we don't know why we do certain things or how the tradition got started. We still do them, however. Like, who knows why we send cards and chocolates and flowers on February the 14th? I mean, really, it's a lovely tradition, but where did it come from? I'm with Tevye. I don't know. And then what about that Easter bunny thing? Where'd that come from? I'm with Tevye. I don't know. And what about the fact that, this one, I have searched the internet, I have Googled, and I still can't come up with a definite answer on why we bring flammable evergreens into our houses around Christmas time. And we cover them with colored things and lights and things. I have a little sense of what the light means, but the rest of it, I'm with Tevye. I don't know. And I suspect that for many people, the sacrament of Holy Communion is about the same. We have a sense that it's something we ought to do, sense that it maybe connects us with God, but really that little piece of bread, that little cup, lots of people are with Tevye. Don't know. Now, to help you, I want you to use your imagination this morning. Pretend you've got a time machine that can not only take you to various times, but it can change your geographic location. So you're going back. Use your imagination. You go back to Jerusalem, and the year is 10 BC. 10 BC. So you're a stranger in town, family, whoever invites you for a meal. And it's not just any meal, it's one of their special days, and this meal is called Pesach. And you sit down, and there are various vegetables and matzah and lamb and jugs of wine on the table. But before they eat, the oldest person, the oldest man, starts to tell a story. And he takes some of the vegetables and he dips them in salt water and things, and he takes the matzah and he breaks it, and he speaks with this sing-song sort of voice, and he's telling what must be an old story because the rest of the people around there are nodding and they smile occasionally. And the youngest says, Ma nishtana, what makes this night different from the others? And the old man continues, and he talks about how their ancestors entered the land of Egypt and how they became enslaved. We've been reading those passages the last couple of weeks. How they were overworked and abused, and how God finally led them out of this bondage. Pharaoh had refused to let the people go, and so these plagues went out over Egypt, and one went, and another, and another, and another. And the last one, a plague on firstborn sons. The Hebrews were to sacrifice lambs, and then they were to paint the doorposts and the lintels of their houses with the blood of the lamb. And that was a sign to one who is called in the text the destroyer to pass over the marked houses. And the plague only then fell upon the Egyptians. And with this plague, Pharaoh finally decides to relent and let the people go, and so they went. But soon he realized his labor force, this free labor force that he has, is gone, and he sends out an army after them. And the man's telling the story about how his people were trapped by the sea, but miraculously God provides a path for them to the other side. And then he continues about what the foremothers did in the wilderness and how they received the law and were brought into the promised land, and keeps going, the great acts of God throughout history. And this is something the Jewish people have done generation after generation. And you're there and you're thinking, tradition. And you begin to eat with them, and you take some of the bitter herbs, and you're told that they're supposed to remind you of the bitterness of the bondage in Egypt. And you dip vegetables in salt water, and that's supposed to remind you of the tears that were shed in Egypt. And you eat unleavened bread and drink from the fruit of the vine, all ordinary things, but they all come together in this meal of remembrance that helps people remember the past, experience God in the present, and then look forward to life with this faithful God. Now we're going to make a change. Get back into your time machine. And imagine going forward about 40 years. It's now AD 30. And you're in Jerusalem. And you find a group of people, and they're laughing, and they're joking, and they're making preparations for this meal again, Pesach. And when the man at the head of the table begins to speak, the person who invited you in says, "That's the rabbi, the teacher." And he recites the same story that you heard on your last trip, and again you hear all these acts of God in the past, and how God brought the people into freedom and delivered them. And the rabbi continues on, and he's retelling the stories about God's gracious acts. And as he's bringing the story to a close, he breaks some bread, and he says, "This is my body that was given for you." And then he takes the cup and he says, "This is my blood that was shed for you. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." And the people around the room are beginning to ponder and to think and whisper among themselves. And you ask your host, what's going on? And he says, "Well, it's as though the teacher... I'm not sure." Well, you stick around for a few days. And after you've had this Pesach meal, you go out with Jesus to a garden called Gethsemane, and it's quiet. And you notice that this rabbi draws aside for prayer, and it's quiet. And then suddenly a group of armed men come in, and there's commotion and discussion, and then they drag Jesus away. And you go along. And you see, he's questioned by the priests, he's questioned by the governor, he's flogged, he's degraded. And then this seemingly gentle man, the next day, he's put on a cross, nailed, and he dies. And his followers are devastated. And you linger. And you try to support them. And then there's this commotion on the third day, on the the first day of the week. And there's some women come rushing in and say they've seen him. Not true. And you're sitting with others in the room, and suddenly he's there. And there's disbelief, and there's excitement, and there's fear. Unbelievable. And there's one thing that everybody in that room knows, that life is never going to be the same again. And you're whisked back in your time travel to here and to now and at Eastminster United Church on the 1st of October 2017. Now, I can't tell you everything about communion in one short sermon, but I can tell you that your imaginary travels today reveal something about where communion came from. And the foundation of this meal, it's in the tradition of the Jewish Passover. And specifically in that Pesach, that's Passover, it's in that Pesach that Jesus oversaw, which Christians later called the Last Supper. And in that supper, Jesus recounted the acts of God, as every Jew had for centuries. And he remembered the deliverance from Egypt. And then at the end of the story, he breaks bread and says, "This is my body." And he takes the cup, and "This is my blood, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And what Jesus was doing, he's aligning himself with everything that God had done up to that point. And he's delivering, God's still at work and delivering people, again, not this time perhaps from a physical thing, but from the spiritual thing, the spiritual problem that we have, bondage with sin. And Jesus wanted his people to think that all that God had done in the past, all that God is continuing to do in the present through him, and then he's pointing toward a future, because after Paul retells that, Paul says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." And that tradition has been passed down in the church ever since. And we call it communion, and few things have changed. The meal has turned into a little piece of bread and a little cup, but we'll talk about that in another Communion Sunday. But we too, we want to remember the past, remember what God has done and the Exodus, and remember what God did in Jesus especially. We want to draw near to God in the present and commune with him. We want to look to the future, because we're proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. And we're looking forward to something, another meal. Not that Pesach in the past, or the Pesach as it's observed in Jewish society today, but a heavenly banquet. I remember a few years ago, I was shocked, as many people were, by what happened to a group of Coptic Christians as they met for communion in their church in Egypt. And it was an ordinary service until a bomber left a car with an explosive device outside their sanctuary, and it detonated just as they were leaving the building and killed 21 people, and it injured 79. And there have been many more incidents since then where the Coptic Christians have been persecuted, let's say, subject to terrorism. One of the recent ones, I was just reading a report. The wife of one of the men who died was interviewed on national television. And she said this out of faith. "They have placed my husband in a place where no one else could place him, with Christ." And in faith, she said, national television, I hope that God will forgive the perpetrators. And then, in faith, she made a tremendous statement. She said, I forgive. We forgive. And according to the news article, many Muslims in Egypt were actually moved by this woman's words, and the interviewer stopped, didn't know what to say for 12 seconds, which, if you've ever done anything on radio or television, that's an eternity. Do this in remembrance of me, said Jesus. Do it in remembrance of me. We remember the past, we commune in the present, but we're thinking forward to Christ's return and a heavenly banquet. And what this woman in the Coptic Christianity was saying is that is real.